All right, so let's dive into this hostage deal that was just struck between Israel and Hamas. It's bringing at least a temporary halt to this 15-month conflict they've been having.
Yeah.
And we've got some great sources to dig into today. We've got excerpts from the news broadcast that actually announced this deal, and then there's a really interesting Q&A session that happened right afterwards. And you won't believe how much they managed to pack into this agreement. I mean, we're talking about a ceasefire, we're talking about hostage releases, we're talking about troop withdrawals, and there's even been some talk about a permanent peace agreement, and even some massive reconstruction efforts.
Yeah, you know what's really striking to me here is just how ambitious this whole deal is. It's not just about, putting out the fire that's right in front of them right now. It's about trying to deal with all of those deep-rooted issues that have been fueling this conflict. I mean, for decades now we can see this. So they're really going for a complete reset in the region, and that's a very tall order.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
So how does this actually play out? How does this all work?
Well, the news broadcast laid out this 3-phase framework, and it seems like each step really depends on the one that comes before it.
Right, yeah, it's like a very carefully choreographed sequence. Phase 1 is really the foundation, and it's all about trying to build that trust between the two sides. So that means a complete ceasefire,
Okay.
like a total ceasefire. And Israeli troops are going to be pulling back from populated areas in Gaza, and in return, Hamas is going to release the first wave of hostages, including some Americans.
Okay.
And then the Israeli side, Israel's going to release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners.
Wow. And this first phase, there's a pretty strict deadline, right? It's only 6 weeks. It seems like they're really trying to keep things moving here and make sure that nobody starts to backslide. Exactly, and that's where the deal gets really interesting. It actually says that even if they don't get all the details worked out in those 6 weeks, the ceasefire will stay in place as long as they're still negotiating. They're committed to keeping the dialogue going no matter what. It could take months. It could take years.
Right, well, that makes sense. I noticed the news mentioned that Kuwait and Egypt are going to be involved too. Are they going to be kind of like the referees in this whole thing?
Yeah, I think mediators might be a better word. They're going to try to keep things moving in the right direction, especially, with all the bad blood between Israel and Hamas. And this is where the international pressure really comes in. The whole world is watching this, and everybody wants to see them succeed.
Right, for sure. And speaking of pressure, the president really emphasized how important the U.S. was in getting Hamas to the table.
Yeah, he definitely took credit for that. He pointed to a whole bunch of events that, he said, really shifted the balance of power. Things like the death of that Hamas leader, Sinwar, and the fact that Iran is weaker now than recently. He said there was a U.S.-led coalition that stopped Iranian attacks on Israel. It all kind of created a sense that things were changing in the region.
Right, he even talked about how the U.S. helped Israel when they attacked Iranian air defense systems. Do you think that was the deliberate strategy to kind of show everybody how strong they were?
Yeah.
And maybe force Hamas to make a deal?
It's hard to ignore that possibility. It definitely sent a message. And he also talked about how Hezbollah is weaker now too, and that's another one of Hamas's big allies. And on top of that, there's a new president in Lebanon who's not connected to Hezbollah like the last one was. So yeah, it definitely seems like things are changing in the region.
Interesting, yeah. So it sounds like the U.S. was pretty aggressive, and it worked. But now the big question is, what does this all mean for the Middle East in the long run? Because the president seemed pretty optimistic, didn't he?
Oh yeah, he was very hopeful. He talked about how this could start a chain reaction and lead to a much more peaceful Middle East. He talked about Lebanon being free from Hezbollah and Syria without Assad, and maybe even a pathway to a Palestinian state. It was a pretty bold vision.
It was, yeah. And he didn't stop there. He even talked about Israel normalizing relations with all of its Arab neighbors, and maybe even an economic corridor that stretches all the way from India to Europe. I mean, is this really the beginning of a new era in the Middle East?
It's an exciting idea, but I think we need to be cautious. The Middle East is a very complicated place. There are a lot of different alliances and a lot of rivalries, and there's still a lot of risks. Even the president admitted that. He talked about the threat of ISIS. And even though Iran is weaker, they're still dangerous.
Right, for sure. And here's another thing that makes this whole situation even more complex. This deal was negotiated by the outgoing administration, so the new administration is going to have to implement it.
Yeah, that's really unusual. It's not every day that you see a deal this big spanning across 2 different presidencies. It definitely adds another layer of uncertainty to the whole thing.
It does. But the president did say that they're working closely with the incoming team to make sure there's a smooth transition.
Well, that's good to hear. That kind of coordination is going to be really important.
Yeah.
They need to present a united front if they want this deal to succeed.
Absolutely. So I guess we're left with this weird mix of hope and apprehension. Something really big has happened, but there's still a big question mark hanging over it all.
Yeah, exactly. The potential is definitely there, but there are also a lot of ways this could go wrong. It's like they built this incredible machine for peace, but it's also incredibly fragile.
Yeah. All right, before we start taking questions from the listeners, I would go back to the hostage releases for a minute. The news footage didn't really give us a lot of details about how that's going to work.
Sure, yeah.
Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so we're still waiting on the final numbers. But we do know that there are Americans included in the first wave of releases.
Okay.
The president confirmed that. And he said they're going to prioritize women, the elderly, and anyone who's wounded.
And in return, Israel's going to release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. That seems like a really crucial first step.
It is. It's about building trust, showing each other that they're serious about this. It's all about good faith and setting the stage for the harder negotiations that are going to come later. I mean, remember, this is just phase one.
Right. So let's say everything goes smoothly. They get through the first phase. What happens in phase 2?
Well, after the first 6 weeks, assuming the talks are still going on and they're making progress, then they'll exchange the rest of the living hostages, which includes male soldiers.
Okay.
And at that point, all Israeli forces will withdraw from Gaza completely. And the ceasefire becomes permanent. It's a very step-by-step process. Each phase builds on the one before it.
So it's like climbing a ladder. Each rung gets them a little closer to peace. But what about the hostages who didn't survive?
Phase 3 deals with that. Their families will finally get some closure, their remains will be returned, and there's going to be a big reconstruction plan for Gaza.
It's hard to imagine what those families have been going through. It must be bittersweet for them, even with all this hope for the future.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a huge human cost in this conflict. We can't forget that. And rebuilding Gaza is going to be a massive undertaking. But the president seems to believe that this deal could really create a better future for the Palestinian people.
He even suggested that this could be a chance for Gaza to move forward without Hamas. Do you think that's realistic?
That's a controversial statement for sure. It's hard to say how things will actually play out, but it does show that there's a possibility for some big political shifts.
Yeah. One last thing before we move on to the listener questions. I was really struck by what the president said about the diplomatic team that worked on this deal. It sounded like they put in an incredible amount of effort.
He did. He gave a shout out to Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and a few other key people who were really important in this whole process. He even quoted former Senator George Mitchell, who was a big part of the Northern Ireland peace process. He said, "Diplomacy is 700 days of failure and 1 day of success."
Wow. That's powerful. It really shows how dedicated these people were.
Yeah, they clearly faced a lot of setbacks, but they never gave up. And in the end, they managed to get this agreement.
Now the question is, will it last?
That's the million-dollar question.
Can this deal actually bring lasting peace and stability?
Okay, so let's jump into some of the questions that you guys have sent in about this hostage deal. A lot of you are curious about the prisoner exchange, and rightfully so. The news broadcast was a little bit vague on the details.
Yeah, there were definitely some unanswered questions there. Do we know, exactly how many prisoners each side is releasing? And who are these people?
Well, at this point, it's kind of a waiting game. The agreement says that Israel's going to release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in that first phase. But the exact numbers and how they're choosing who to release, that's all still being worked out. It'll probably come out as part of the negotiations.
Makes sense. They probably want to keep some of that stuff secret for now, especially with such a delicate situation. But this brings up another question that we got from a lot of listeners. How do we know that both sides are going to actually keep their promises? What's to stop one side from just backing out of the deal?
That's where verification comes in. It's really important for any ceasefire agreement, especially one as complicated as this one. The news didn't really go into detail about how they're going to do it, but I think it's safe to assume that there will be some international observers involved. They'll be kind of like impartial referees.
So it's not just a matter of taking each other's word for it.
No, not at all. We'll probably see organizations like the UN or the Red Cross getting involved. They'll be monitoring the ceasefire and the troop withdrawals and the hostage releases. You can think of them as independent eyes on the ground, making sure everything happens according to plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. That kind of oversight seems really important. It's got to help build confidence.
It does, yeah. And make sure that neither side feels like they're getting tricked. Transparency is really key in these situations.
Okay, let's talk about Iran for a minute. The president made it sound like Iran being weaker was a big reason why Hamas decided to negotiate. But a lot of you guys were wondering if that's really true. After all, Iran wasn't actually part of the talks.
Right, they weren't physically there at the negotiating table. But there's no question that they have a lot of influence in the region. The president's argument is that the U.S. basically squeezed Hamas by weakening Hezbollah and disrupting Iranian attacks on Israel and building that international coalition. He's saying that all of that left Hamas with fewer options and made them more likely to make a deal.
So it was more about indirect pressure than direct involvement.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating a situation where negotiation seems like the best choice for Hamas. But some of our listeners have pointed out that Iran has been through sanctions before, and they've always managed to survive. They still have a lot of influence. What do you think about that?
That's a good point. Iran is definitely resilient. They've gotten pretty good at dealing with sanctions. It takes a long time to weaken a country like Iran. It's not going to happen overnight. The U.S. and its allies might have made them a little bit weaker, but I think it's too early to say that they're weaker than they've been in decades, like the president said.
So we're not really sure how much weaker Iran actually is.
I think that's fair to say. We'll have to wait and see how things play out over time. It's possible that Iran will find new ways to be powerful.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the people who are most affected by this conflict. A lot of our listeners want to know if this deal is actually going to improve the lives of ordinary Palestinians in Gaza. They've been living in really tough conditions for years. Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? In the end, this deal will be judged by whether it actually makes a difference for people on the ground. The president talked about this reconstruction plan for Gaza. If it works, it could bring a lot of resources into Gaza, which could mean better infrastructure, better healthcare, a better economy.
But that's a big if. Some people are worried about things like corruption or political infighting. Could that get in the way of the reconstruction?
Definitely, those are valid concerns. They need to make sure that the aid and resources actually get to the people who need them. And the political situation between Hamas and Fatah could make things more complicated.
It sounds like there are a lot of ways this could go wrong.
There are.
What else should we be worried about?
Well, we've already talked about some of the big ones, like the need for good verification mechanisms, and the threat from groups like ISIS, and the fact that we don't know if the new administration will support the deal. But there's more to it than that.
Like what?
Well, if Hamas or any other militant group does something provocative, that could start the conflict up again. And we can't forget about all the underlying issues that caused this conflict in the first place, like the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the blockade of Gaza. Those are really complicated issues, and they haven't been solved yet.
So even if this deal works perfectly, it's really just the beginning.
Exactly. It's just the first step on a very long road to peace.
It's like taking care of a wound that's been infected for a long time. This deal might stop the bleeding, but it's going to take a long time for it to heal, and they're going to have to keep working on it.
That's a great analogy.
We can't get so caught up in this deal that we forget about the bigger picture.
Right.
This is a big deal, is potentially a turning point, but it doesn't magically solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It doesn't. It's important to remember that.
So what can our listeners do to stay informed about all of this? How can they go beyond just reading the headlines?
Well, the best thing to do is to explore different perspectives. We've talked about what the president thinks, but that's just one side of the story. Read what analysts and academics and journalists are saying, and most importantly, listen to the people who are actually affected by this conflict, both Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. Hearing from people who are actually living through this, especially in Gaza, that's really important.
It is. It helps us understand the human cost of this conflict and what this deal really means for people's lives. There are a lot of resources out there. News articles, documentaries, podcasts, even social media.
Yeah.
You can get a glimpse into what people are going through. It's about putting all the pieces together and seeing the situation from different angles so you can form your own opinion.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with it, asking questions, and looking for different points of view.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's about understanding that these issues are complicated. And there are rarely easy answers. I think that's something we should all strive for. Because if we understand complex issues, that's a step towards creating a more peaceful and just world.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, let's talk about another aspect of this deal that's gotten a lot of attention. The economic implications. The president talked about this potential economic corridor that would span multiple continents. What does that actually mean?
That's a great question. The economic potential of this deal, and especially that economic corridor from India to Europe, that's something that a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, it could have a huge impact, not just in the Middle East, but on the whole global economy.
Absolutely. But just like everything else with this deal, the economics are complicated. There are a lot of potential problems. I think this is something that deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's unpack all of that in the next part of our exploration. Okay, so let's get into the economics of all of this. The president talked about this really exciting vision for the Middle East, revitalized, integrated into these global trade networks, and this massive economic corridor that stretches all the way from India to Europe. It sounds almost too good to be true.
It's definitely ambitious, but it could be a total game changer if it actually works. Imagine a Middle East where countries are working together to build a more prosperous future instead of constantly fighting with each other.
Right, that would be a huge shift from what we've seen for decades. So let's say it does work. What are some of the potential benefits?
Well, first of all, more trade and investment. That could lead to a lot of economic growth. We could see lots of new jobs, better infrastructure, a boost for industries that have been struggling. It would be especially helpful for countries like Jordan and Egypt. They've been having some tough economic times. And of course, for Gaza, if they can rebuild. That influx of resources could really transform things.
And it sounds like Israel would benefit too. They'd become even more of an economic powerhouse in the region.
Exactly. Closer ties with Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, that would open up a lot of opportunities for Israeli businesses. And with this economic corridor, Israel could become a major hub for trade between Asia and Europe.
That would give them a big advantage. But there must be some downsides too, right? What are some of the challenges that could get in the way?
I think the biggest challenge is overcoming all the distrust and animosity that's been built up over so many years. Can you really create a strong economic partnership when there's so much suspicion and resentment?
Right, and some of our listeners have pointed out that there's already a big economic gap between Israel and its neighbors.
Right.
Could that create even more problems?
Yeah, that's a real concern. If the benefits aren't shared fairly, it could make things worse. They have to make sure that everyone benefits from this if they want it to work in the long run.
And what about a Palestinian state? Where does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, it feels like that's been kind of forgotten with all this talk about economics,
Right.
but it's a crucial part of the equation. If they want real peace and stability, they need a Palestinian state that can thrive economically. But that's not going to be easy. It means dealing with all those really tough issues like borders and the status of Jerusalem, the same issues that have been blocking peace for decades.
So it's a huge challenge. Some of our listeners are worried that this focus on economics is just a way to avoid those political problems.
Yeah, I can see why they'd think that. There's a risk that they'll try to use economic incentives to pressure the Palestinians into accepting things they don't want.
So we have to be careful about that. It seems like the economic potential is real, but it's all tied up with these unresolved political issues.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the question of implementation. For this economic vision to work, they need a lot of things to go right. Political stability, real cooperation, good governance, and everyone has to be committed to making it work.
And it all depends on the hostage deal actually succeeding, if the ceasefire falls apart and the violence starts again.
Yeah.
This whole economic vision goes out the window.
It does. It's a very precarious situation.
So what should our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the best approach is cautious optimism. This deal gives us some hope. It's a chance to break out of this cycle of violence. And the economic vision is really exciting. It could change a lot of lives for the better and really reshape the Middle East.
But we have to be realistic.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy.
No, it's going to take a lot of hard work and some really tough conversations.
This story is far from over.
It is.
There's still a lot that could happen.
Right.
But the more we engage with these issues and ask tough questions
Yeah.
and look for different perspectives, the better we'll understand this whole situation.
That's exactly what we try to do on the deep dive.
Right. We're not here to tell you what to think. We want to give you the information and the tools so you can form your own opinions.
So keep digging, keep questioning, keep the conversation going. The future of the Middle East, and really the future of the world, depends on people being informed and engaged.
Absolutely. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the most fascinating and important issues of our time.